As German tanks tore across Soviet land, Soviet workers were doing something that sounded almost insane. They were pulling whole factories apart piece by piece, loading giant machines onto trains, and sending them east into the dark, far beyond the Ural Mountains. That was the kind of war this had become. Hitler did not march into the Soviet Union because he thought it would be a long, bloody gamble. He marched in because he thought the whole country was already rotten inside. He believed one hard strike from the German army would make it cave in. He looked at Stalin, looked at the Red Army, looked at the Soviet people and saw weakness. He thought the state was built on fear, lies, and thin steel. He thought it would snap the second real pressure hit it. At first, it looked like he was right. The German invasion smashed forward with terrifying speed. Soviet troops were trapped in huge numbers. Cities fell. Roads filled with smoke, wrecked trucks, dead horses, broken guns, and families running east with whatever they could carry. If you're new here, please subscribe, like this video, and comment your country or thoughts below so we can keep bringing you powerful history stories that deserve to be remembered. German officers looked at the map and saw victory opening in front of them. Hitler's belief grew even stronger. He did not think he was fighting a nation that could recover. He thought he was kicking down a door, and behind that door stood Joseph Stalin. Stalin was not a warm man. He was not easy to love. He ruled through fear, suspicion, and iron control. Many of his own people had already suffered under him long before Hitler came. But when the storm broke over the Soviet Union, Stalin did one thing that changed the story of the war. He did not run. He did not surrender. He did not beg for peace. He stayed where he was, and he forced his country to stay in the fight with him. That mattered because the stakes were not just high. They were everything. If the Soviet Union fell, Hitler would gain land, food, oil, workers, mines, and roads stretching deep into Eurasia. Germany would become harder to beat. Britain would face an even darker future. Much of Europe would remain trapped. Millions more would fall under Nazi rule. This was not a border war. This was a fight over whether entire peoples would live free, starve under occupation, or be erased. Hitler believed that fear could knock the Soviet Union flat. What he did not understand was that fear can also harden people when there is nowhere left to go. The first weeks of the invasion were a nightmare. German armor moved fast. Soviet lines cracked. Planes burned on the ground. Units were cut off before they even knew what was happening. Men marched into battle with weak supply lines, poor communication, and commanders who often had no clear picture of the disaster unfolding around them. Some divisions were swallowed whole. Some soldiers fought until they ran out of bullets. Some vanished inside giant pockets as the German army closed around them like steel jaws. It looked like the Soviet Union had been caught asleep, and for a while that was close to the truth. Hitler watched this collapse and felt his own ideas being proven. He had always sneered at the Soviet state. He looked at it as something ugly and fake, held up by force and ready to shatter. He looked down on Slavic people with contempt. He thought the Red Army had no real backbone. He thought one fast campaign would smash the whole thing. Every burning Soviet truck, every captured column, every city taken in a rush seemed to say the same thing to him. You were right, but wars are not won by the first roar alone. Behind the lines, beyond the front, deep in the factories and rail yards, another battle had begun. While German troops drove east, Soviet workers were racing against time itself. They stripped down entire plants that made tanks, rifles, shells, and aircraft. Not blueprints, not ideas, real factories. Great iron presses, machine tools, conveyor systems, crates of parts. They pulled them from the ground, lifted them onto trains, and sent them east before the Germans could overrun them. Men, women, and even teenagers worked in dust, smoke, and panic, knowing that if they failed, the Soviet war machine could go silent. They rode with the equipment. They slept beside it. They reached empty sites in the east and began rebuilding under impossible pressure. Some factories started again in half-finished buildings. Some had no proper walls at first. Some workers stood in freezing air and still kept going because they knew what it meant if those machines did not run. Hitler did not see that part clearly enough. He understood attack. He understood shock. He understood how to break an enemy at the edge. But he did not fully understand the depth of the land he had invaded or the stubborn strength of a state willing to throw everything into survival. The Soviet Union was not a small country that could be crushed with one blow to the chest. It was vast, wounded, and ugly, but still alive. It could lose ground and keep breathing. It could lose armies and still raise more. It could lose cities and still build fresh weapons far away from the front. That was the trap Hitler had stepped into without knowing it. The farther his army pushed, the longer the road home became. The lines of supply stretched thin. Fuel had to travel farther. Repairs took longer. Food came slower. Horses died, trucks broke down, dust turned to mud. What looked easy on a map began to feel heavy in real life. And still the Red Army fought, sometimes badly, sometimes in panic, sometimes with shocking courage. Many Soviet soldiers were not fighting because they loved Stalin. Many were fighting because the enemy in front of them meant death, ruin, and occupation. They were fighting for villages, wives, children, fields, and homes. They were fighting because behind them there was nothing safe left to retreat into. The closer the German army came to key Soviet centers, the harsher the fighting became. This was not clean war. It was not noble. It was not simple. Soviet commanders made hard and often brutal choices. Men were ordered to hold ground at terrible cost. Retreat could bring punishment. Fear lived on both sides, yet the center did not break. That was the fact that started to change everything. Hitler had built his whole invasion on one belief. The Soviet Union would collapse quickly, but quick collapse never came. Instead, the country bent, bled, and somehow stayed on its feet. Stalin became the face of that refusal. He had helped create a hard state, and now that hard state was turning itself into a weapon of survival. He demanded sacrifice. He called for resistance. He made it plain that this war would not end with a bargain. Soviet propaganda thundered through the nation. Workers were told every shell mattered. Civilians dug trenches. Rail crews worked without rest. Women took on huge roles in factories, fields, and support work as the pressure grew. The state that Hitler believed would crumble instead started feeding the war with grim force. Then came the cold. That was another turning point. German troops had expected a fast victory. They thought the campaign would be done before winter became the real enemy. Instead, they found distance, mud, exhaustion, and then a season that seemed to rise from the ground itself to punish them. Roads turned to sludge. Wheels sank. Engines coughed and failed. Men froze in thin gear. Weapons jammed. Supplies lagged behind. Soldiers who had marched like conquerors now dug into frozen earth and stared at a sky that offered no mercy. Winter alone did not save the Soviet Union, but it punished German mistakes and made a hard war even harder. The Red Army, battered and bleeding, was still there. Soviet workers, hidden behind the Urals, were still building. Stalin, cruel but unbroken, was still demanding more resistance. And the German army, which had expected the Soviet state to drop dead, now found itself stuck in a giant war it had not truly understood. That change was deadly. Once a fast war becomes a long war, every false belief begins to cost lives. Hitler had told himself he was kicking down a rotten door, but the door did not fall. It groaned, it split, it shook, yet it stayed standing. And behind it was not just Stalin. Behind it were millions of people dragged into a fight for survival. Behind it were rail lines running east with machines that would come back as tanks and guns. Behind it were soldiers learning through pain. Behind it was a state that had every reason to break, yet still refused to die. That is what makes this chapter of the story so gripping. The man Hitler thought would crack under pressure did not crack. The country he believed would cave in did not cave in. The army he mocked did not vanish. It took terrible blows and gave ground by the mile, but it stayed in the war long enough for Germany's early confidence to start turning into strain. The Soviet Union was not winning yet. Far from it. The losses were horrific. Whole regions were in chaos. Villages burned. Families were torn apart. Prisoners filled camps. The front was still a rolling disaster in many places, but now the war had changed shape. Germany was no longer chasing a dying enemy. It was wrestling with a giant that had survived the first hammer blow, and in war, that is the moment danger changes sides. Once your enemy lives through the strike that was supposed to end him, he starts becoming something else. He becomes a problem, then a threat. Then, if you are not careful, your destroyer. By the time the early thunder of the invasion had passed, that truth was starting to show. Stalin had survived the first blow. Soviet industry had escaped east. The Red Army, bloodied but not destroyed, was still in the field. Hitler had gambled on quick collapse. Instead, he had opened a front that would swallow men, fuel, time, and hope. He still believed he could win. He still believed the Soviet Union was one hard shove from the edge. But the ground beneath that belief was already cracking. The laughter had not stopped yet, but it was no longer as loud. Ahead lay a city on the Volga. Ahead lay smoke, rubble, close-range killing, and a battle so savage it would leave the world stunned. Ahead lay the place where Hitler's mockery would turn into dread. Ahead lay Stalingrad, where the man he thought would break would begin to break him. Ahead lay Stalingrad, and Stalingrad was not just another city on a map. It was a name. It was a target. It was a prize that Hitler wanted for military reasons, for pride, and for the thrill of breaking something that carried Stalin's own name. He wanted the city on the Volga. He wanted the route it controlled. He wanted the oil fields beyond it. He wanted one more great victory in the East that would prove the Soviet Union was finished after all. But what he reached was not a clean battlefield. What he reached was a nightmare that swallowed plans, men, and hope. By the time the struggle closed around the city, Stalingrad no longer looked like a place where people lived. It looked like the end of the world. Walls were cracked open. Streets were buried under broken brick. Factories burned through the night. Smoke rolled over the river. The air itself felt used up. Yet even in that wreck, life and death kept moving. Soviet troops crossed the Volga under fire. Workers still tried to keep machines alive. Officers shouted over the roar. Snipers waited in ruins. Small groups of men held rooms, stairwells, cellars, and half-collapsed halls as if the whole war rested on that one patch of ground. In a way, it did. Hitler believed the Soviet Union was running out of strength. He believed one more blow like this would finish the job. What he did not understand was that Stalingrad was becoming the kind of battle where numbers and machines alone were not enough. It became a test of nerve, patience, and pain. Every yard cost blood. Every building became its own war. Some places changed hands several times. One day a floor belonged to the Germans. The next day the basement belonged to the Soviets. Above them, shells crashed through roofs. Below them, men listened for footsteps in the dark. The city had been turned into a trap made of dust, metal, and fire. This was where Hitler's army lost one of the things that had made it so deadly in the first place: speed. In the open field, German forces were fast, sharp, and hard to stop. In a broken city packed with rubble, smashed pipes, twisted beams, and hidden defenders, speed died. Tanks could not glide through heaps of wreckage like they moved across open ground. Clean lines of attack became snarled. A single machine gun hidden in a blasted wall could hold up an advance. A sniper in a chimney could turn a street into a killing zone. German officers found themselves fighting for places that, in another war, might not have mattered at all. A grain elevator, a workshop, a rail yard, a stairwell, a kitchen, a pile of shattered concrete. The battle shrank down until men were fighting for scraps of ground that seemed too small to matter, yet mattered enough to decide who lived through the next hour. Soviet defenders understood something important. They could not let the Germans breathe. If they fell back too far, German firepower would crush them. So they stayed close. They clung to the enemy. They forced the fighting into brutal close quarters where German guns and aircraft could not always be used freely. They made every advance feel cursed. A unit might push ahead and think the area was secure, only to be hit from a hole in the wall or a hidden trench. Night brought no real peace. Reinforcements crossed the river. Wounded men were pulled back if they were lucky. More ammunition came over in the dark. More orders came too. Hold, endure, do not break. Stalin demanded the city be held, and the order came down with all the hard force of his rule. There would be no easy retreat. There would be no gift of Stalingrad to Hitler. This part of the story matters because it shows what made the battle so different. It was not won by one dramatic charge or one speech alone. It was won by grim refusal, by soldiers who stayed in rubble because there was nowhere safer to go, by workers who kept the war moving from far behind the front, by commanders who understood that time itself could become a weapon. The longer the Germans stayed trapped in that ruined city, the more their strength bled away. And while Hitler stared at the city and demanded it be taken, the Soviet High Command was looking beyond the wreckage. That was the turn he did not see clearly enough. German troops were pouring their energy into Stalingrad itself, but their flanks were stretched out and held in many places by forces weaker than the core German units. Those lines mattered. They were the sides of the fist. If they cracked, the hand could not stay closed. Soviet planners saw this. They gathered reserves. They moved men, guns, tanks, and supplies into place. They prepared not just to defend the city but to strike around it. That plan would change the whole war. When the counterattack came, it did not begin with some great speech that froze history in place. It came with force, timing, and direction. The Red Army smashed into the weaker flanks north and south of Stalingrad. The ground that had seemed steady suddenly gave way. The attack rolled forward. Lines split. Defenders fell back or were overrun. The ring around the Germans tightened with shocking speed. Then the trap closed. Inside Stalingrad and around it sat a huge German force trapped. The hunters had become the hunted. The army that had driven across Europe with pride now found itself cut off in a frozen ruin far from home. This was the moment Hitler's great gamble began collapsing in plain sight. He had laughed at the Soviet Union. He had treated it like a weak door ready to splinter. Now that same enemy had pinned down one of his major armies and locked it in a cage of snow, smoke, hunger, and steel. This did not happen because Stalin was a hero in the simple movie sense. He was not. He remained a harsh ruler. But under him, and often despite the fear he created, the Soviet system had done what Hitler said it could never do. It had taken blow after blow and still found the strength to answer with one that changed the war. The trapped German troops waited for rescue. Hitler told them to hold. He told them they could be supplied. He told them the position could be saved. Those promises turned cruel inside the winter. Supplies did not arrive in enough volume. Cold sank its teeth into everything. Food ran short. Ammunition became precious. Men weakened. Frost, sickness, and exhaustion spread. The trapped force was still dangerous, but it was no longer the sharp spearhead that had once terrified Europe. It was becoming a starving mass clinging to shrinking ground. This is where Hitler's pride made the disaster worse. He would not let go. He would not accept the full truth in time. He had wanted Stalingrad as a symbol, and now he refused to release it even when it was wrecking his army. That stubborn pride met Stalin's own stubborn refusal, but only one side had the advantage now. The Soviets were outside the ring, building pressure, choosing where to strike next and watching the trap work. Inside the pocket. Time became an enemy stronger than bullets. At last the end came. The trapped German army in Stalingrad collapsed. When it did, the shock ran far beyond the city. This was not just another setback. This was a deep wound to Hitler's image. For years, Germany had looked unstoppable. Its victories had piled up. Its armies had moved like thunder. Even when it hit trouble, many still believed it would find a way through. Stalingrad shattered that feeling. Here was proof that Nazi Germany could be stopped, surrounded, and broken. Here was proof that the Soviet Union had not only survived, but had learned how to strike back with terrifying force. That is why Stalingrad was a turning point. Not because the war ended there. It did not. Not because Germany instantly collapsed. It did not. The fighting would go on and it would stay savage. But after Stalingrad, the shape of the war changed. The great German drive east had been checked and cracked. The Soviet Union now carried something new into battle: momentum, belief. The sense that the invader could be pushed back step by step, mile by mile, all the way to where he came from. That was the deeper payoff of the battle. Hitler had started the war in the East thinking he was smashing a rotten structure. Instead, he had awakened a giant war machine that kept growing more dangerous the longer it fought. The factories beyond the Urals kept turning. Tanks rolled out. Guns rolled out. Shells rolled out. New armies formed. Soviet commanders grew sharper. Soldiers gained hard experience. The state that was supposed to collapse had become stronger and the very fire meant to destroy it. From there the road led west. not in one smooth line, not without terrible cost. There were more battles, more offensives, more burned towns and buried sons. The Red Army did not float toward victory. It forced its way through mud, smoke, minefields, rivers, and desperate German resistance. But now the pressure ran the other way. Now it was Germany that had to fear the size, anger, and endurance of the Soviet push. Hitler's dream of empire in the East began to rot under the weight of the war he himself had chosen. Every season after Stalingrad made that clearer. The Soviet Union kept coming. Kursk crushed Germany's hope of taking back the initiative. Soviet advances rolled across occupied lands. City after city fell out of Nazi control. The same Red Army Hitler had dismissed as weak became the hammer pounding toward Berlin, and behind that army stood the labor of millions: factory workers, rail crews, nurses, farmers, engineers, women carrying whole sections of the war on their backs, teenagers taking on adult work because there was no other choice. This is important because stories often shrink huge victories down to one face. Stalin mattered, yes. His refusal to surrender mattered. His government's ability to move industry and force the nation into total war mattered. But the fall of the Third Reich was not the work of one man standing alone in a room. It was the work of millions who suffered, fought, built, froze, marched, and died in a struggle so large it almost breaks the mind. Stalin became the symbol at the top of that resistance. But the story was carried by the people under him too. And still, the title hits hard for a reason. The dictator Hitler laughed at did help destroy the Third Reich, because Hitler's fatal mistake was not just underestimating Soviet weapons or Soviet numbers. He underestimated Soviet endurance. He thought the system was too brittle to survive shock. He thought contempt was the same thing as understanding. He confused hatred with insight. That error was one of the deadliest mistakes of the whole war. It pulled Germany into a struggle it could not truly win. It drained men, fuel, time, and strength on a front so huge it devoured certainty itself. Once that trap snapped shut, the end of Hitler's empire became possible. Slow, brutal, and costly, but possible. By the time Soviet troops reached Berlin, the meaning of Stalingrad was complete. The city where Hitler had wanted a trophy became one of the places where his future was broken. The laughter was gone. In its place stood ruins, graves, and a hard truth. The enemy he mocked had survived. The army he sneered at had learned how to destroy him. The state he called rotten had outlasted the strike meant to kill it. And that is what makes this story so powerful. It is not just the tale of one battle. It is the story of arrogance meeting endurance and losing. It is the story of a conqueror who believed speed could replace wisdom. It is the story of workers pulling apart factories in panic and putting them back together far away, of soldiers holding broken buildings because the next step back might mean the end, of commanders waiting for the right moment to close a trap, and of a war that turned on the refusal of a battered nation to die when everyone thought it should. Hitler went east expecting collapse. He found resistance. He pushed deeper expecting surrender. He found Stalingrad. He demanded victory. He got encirclement. He insisted on holding. He got disaster. And from that disaster, the road opened toward the death of the Third Reich itself. Not an easy triumph, because nothing about the Eastern War was easy, but in hard, earned reversal. The city on the Volga did not end the war, but it broke the spell. It proved Nazi Germany could bleed, could fail, and could be driven backward by the very people Hitler had treated as weak. From that point on, the Soviet Union was no longer just surviving. It was coming for the empire that had tried to erase it. And once that began, the end of Hitler's world was only a matter of how much more pain the war would demand before the fire finally reached Berlin.
Thank you for watching and staying with Drafted History to the very end. If this story gripped you, subscribe, like, and drop a comment below. Tell us which battle, leader, or forgotten turning point you want next. Your support helps bring more true, powerful history stories to life here.